I never imagined that moving to a quiet neighborhood in Cedar Rapids, Iowa would turn into a full-blown war with the most vindictive HOA president I'd ever meet. But here I was, standing in my driveway at 6 in the morning with a snow shovel in my hand and a letter that made my blood boil. My name is Xavier Emerson, and I'm a pretty easygoing guy. I work as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant just outside the city, keep to myself mostly, and I bought my modest 3-bedroom house in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision about 8 months ago. The place seemed perfect when I moved in last May. Nice neighbors, well-maintained streets, reasonable HOA fees. I should have known it was too good to be true. The trouble started in late November when Karen Whitmore got elected as the new HOA president. She was a woman in her late 40s with that particular haircut. You know the one, where it's short in the back and longer in the front, always blonde with chunky highlights. She wore velour tracksuits in various pastel colors and had this way of looking at you like you'd personally insulted her grandmother just by existing. Within 2 weeks of taking office, she'd sent violation notices to half the neighborhood for the most ridiculous things. My next-door neighbor got cited because his garbage can lid was 3 inches ajar on a non-collection day. The family across the street received a fine because their Christmas wreath was considered too large according to some obscure bylaw Karen had dug up from 1987. I'd managed to avoid her wrath until that February morning when Iowa got hit with one of the worst snowstorms we'd seen in years. 23 inches fell overnight, and the temperature dropped to -15 degrees. I'd woken up early to start clearing my driveway before work, which is when I found the certified letter taped to my front door. The letter informed me that due to my proximity to the community entrance, I was now responsible for clearing not just my own driveway, but also the driveway of the HOA office building, which sat at the corner of my street. The building was about 200 feet from my house, and its driveway was easily 3 times the size of mine. The letter stated that this was in accordance with Section 12.7 of the HOA bylaws, which discussed community responsibility sharing for properties adjacent to communal structures. I read the letter 3 times, my breath creating clouds in the frigid air. This was insane. I'd read those bylaws front to back before buying the house, and I knew for a fact that there was no such requirement. Section 12.7 actually dealt with fence height restrictions. But there it was, in Karen's flowery handwriting at the bottom of the printed letter. Failure to comply within 24 hours will result in a fine of $500, increasing by $200 per day thereafter. I called my buddy Dave, who lived 2 streets over in the same neighborhood. He'd been here for 5 years and knew all the HOA drama. "She can't do that, man," Dave said when I read him the letter. "That's complete garbage. The HOA is responsible for maintaining their own property. It's in the budget we all pay into." "So what do I do?" I asked, watching my neighbors begin the arduous task of digging out their own driveways. "You could fight it, but that means going through the HOA dispute process, which Karen controls. Or you could just ignore it and let her try to fine you, then take it to small claims court." I didn't want to deal with either option, but I definitely wasn't going to shovel that massive driveway for free. I had my own property to worry about. So I spent the next 3 hours clearing my driveway and the sidewalk in front of my house, which was actually required by city ordinance. My back was screaming by the time I finished, and I'd worked up a serious sweat despite the Arctic temperatures. I went inside, took a hot shower, and headed to work. When I got home that evening, there was another notice on my door. This one had a photo attached, showing the still snow-covered HOA office driveway. The fine was now officially being processed. Karen had written, and I had until noon the next day to clear it, or the amount would increase to $700. That's when I decided I'd had enough. If Karen wanted to play games, I could play games too. I spent that evening doing research, pulling up the actual HOA bylaws, the covenants, and the Iowa state laws regarding HOA authority. What I found was interesting. Not only was Karen's demand completely baseless, but there was also a clause in our bylaws that stated any HOA board member who abused their authority for personal gain or vendetta could be removed by a vote of the homeowners. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up at 5. The snow had stopped, but another few inches had fallen overnight. I got dressed in my warmest gear, grabbed my snow shovel and headed out. But I didn't go to the HOA office. Instead, I went door to door to every house on my street and the 2 adjacent streets, about 40 houses in total. I told each person what Karen was trying to pull and asked if they'd experienced similar abuse of power. The stories I heard were unbelievable. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman 3 houses down, had been fined because her granddaughter's car was parked in her driveway for too many consecutive days, when the girl had come to help her recover from knee surgery. The Hendersons had received a violation notice because their lawn was unevenly mowed, even though they paid a professional service. Tom Bradley, a veteran who lived at the end of the street, had been cited for displaying an American flag that was disproportionately large for his flagpole, even though it was a standard 3 by 5 foot flag. Everyone was fed up, but they all felt powerless because Karen had 2 other board members who seemed to just go along with whatever she wanted. I told them I had a plan, and I started gathering signatures for an emergency HOA meeting to address the president's conduct. By noon, I had enough signatures. According to the bylaws, if 20% of homeowners requested an emergency meeting, one had to be scheduled within 7 days. I had signatures from 35%, but I still had Karen's ridiculous ultimatum hanging over my head. The noon deadline passed, and sure enough, at 12:15 she came marching down the street toward my house. I saw her coming from my living room window. She was wearing a pink velour tracksuit and white boots that were completely inappropriate for the weather, and she was clutching a folder to her chest. I opened the door before she could knock. "Mr. Emerson," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I'm here to formally notify you that you're now being fined $700 for failure to comply with HOA requirements. Additionally, I'm placing a lien notification on your property, which means nothing," I interrupted, "because you have no legal authority to require me to maintain HOA property. That's not in our bylaws, Karen. I've read them multiple times." Section 12.7 is about fences. Her face flushed red. "I am the HOA president, and I have the authority to interpret and enforce the bylaws as I see fit for the good of the community." "No, actually, you don't. And I've collected signatures from over 1/3 of the neighborhood calling for an emergency meeting to address your abuse of power. So you can take your fake fine and your fake lien and shove them both where the sun doesn't shine." I probably shouldn't have said that last part, but I was tired and angry and my back still hurt from shoveling my own driveway. Karen's expression transformed from fake sweet to absolutely venomous. "You have no idea what you've just done. I will make your life a living hell. That's a promise." She turned and stormed off, nearly slipping on an icy patch in her ridiculous boots. I watched her go, and I'll admit, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. But I also knew this was far from over. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Friday evening at the community center, which was separate from the HOA office building. In the meantime, Karen went on a rampage. She sent violation notices to almost everyone who'd signed my petition. She claimed there were multiple infractions she'd been monitoring. Most of them were completely fabricated or so minor they were laughable, but her biggest mistake came on Tuesday afternoon. I got a call at work from my neighbor, Patricia, who was retired and home most days. "Xavier, you need to get home," she said, her voice urgent. "Karen just had your car towed." "What? My car is in my driveway." "Not anymore. She claimed it was abandoned because it hasn't moved in 3 days." I'd been taking my truck to work because it handled better in the snow, so my sedan had been sitting in my driveway. But that didn't make it abandoned, and it certainly wasn't an HOA violation. I left work early and drove straight home. Sure enough, my car was gone. I found the towing notice stuck to my mailbox. The car had been taken to Bradley's Towing on the south side of town. The fee to retrieve it would be $350 plus $75 per day for storage. I was furious, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was actually good in a way. Karen had just committed what was probably an illegal act. I called the police non-emergency number and explained the situation. The dispatcher said an officer would come by to take a report. Officer Mike Thompson arrived about 30 minutes later. He was a stocky guy in his 30s with a friendly demeanor. I explained everything, showed him the towing notice, and provided photos I'd taken that morning of my car sitting legally in my own driveway. "So let me get this straight," Officer Thompson said, reviewing his notes. "The HOA president called a towing company and had your car removed from your private property without your permission." "That's exactly what happened." "And you're current on your HOA fees. No disputes about payments or anything. Completely current. I can show you the bank statements." He nodded slowly. "This might constitute theft or unauthorized use of property. At minimum, it's a civil matter, but depending on how she authorized the tow, there could be criminal implications." "Do you know which towing company she used?" I showed him the notice. "Bradley's. I know them." "Let me make a call." Officer Thompson stepped away and spoke on his phone for several minutes. When he came back, his expression was serious. "So here's the situation. Bradley's was called by someone claiming to be the property manager for this subdivision. They were told the vehicle was abandoned on community property. The driver who picked it up says he thought he was hooking it from the guest parking lot, not a residential driveway. So Karen lied to the towing company. Potentially, yes. I'm going to need to speak with her directly. "Do you know where I can find her?" I gave him Karen's address, which was just 2 streets over. Officer Thompson said he'd be in touch and left. I spent the next hour on the phone with my insurance company and Bradley's Towing. The towing company agreed to release my car without charge once they understood the situation, and they mentioned they'd be having a conversation with whoever made the fraudulent call. I picked up my car that evening. When I got back home, I saw a police cruiser parked in front of Karen's house. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see Karen gesticulating wildly on her front porch while Officer Thompson took notes. The next morning, I found a nasty note in my mailbox. It wasn't from Karen directly, but from the HOA board, though I recognized her handwriting. The note stated that I was being fined an additional $1,000 for harassment of a board member and filing false police reports. It also said my petition for an emergency meeting was being denied due to procedural irregularities. That was it. I tried to handle this through proper channels, but Karen had made it clear she had no intention of following any rules. So I decided to give her exactly what she'd asked for, just not in the way she expected. Thursday night, Another major snowstorm rolled into Cedar Rapids. The forecast called for 18 to 24 inches. I went to bed watching the snow fall, and a plan formed in my mind. Karen wanted me to clear the HOA office driveway so badly. Fine, I'd clear it, but I'd clear it my way. I woke up at 4 on Friday morning. The snow had stopped, and we'd gotten a solid 20 inches. The entire neighborhood was buried. I got dressed, made a thermos of coffee, and went to my garage. I fired up my snow blower, a beast of a machine I'd bought from a friend who was moving to Arizona. It was a 28-inch two-stage blower with enough power to cut through the heavy, wet snow like butter. I started with my own driveway, clearing it completely and making neat piles on either side. Then I cleared my sidewalk. By 6, the sky was starting to lighten, and a few of my neighbors were emerging to tackle their own snow removal. I waved to them and then headed toward the HOA office building. The office was a small, single-story structure with a large parking lot and a curved driveway leading to the front entrance. As Karen's letter had pointed out, it was technically close to my property, just around the corner and down about 200 feet. The building was dark, since the office didn't open until 9. I positioned myself at the street end of the HOA driveway and fired up the snow blower. Then, I systematically worked my way through the entire parking lot and driveway, clearing every single inch of snow. I was thorough and methodical. The snow blower shot the snow out in a powerful stream, and I very carefully aimed that stream exactly where I wanted it to go. By the time I finished, the HOA office driveway and parking lot were completely clear, right down to the bare pavement. You could have roller skated on it. But the front entrance of the building was completely blocked by a wall of snow that stood over 6 feet high and extended about 15 feet wide. I directed every single ounce of snow from that massive parking lot right up against the front door and windows. It was beautiful. I took several photos for documentation purposes, then calmly packed up my snow blower and went home. I was exhausted but satisfied. I'd done exactly what Karen demanded. I'd cleared the HOA driveway. She never specified where I should put the snow. I took a long, hot shower and was eating breakfast when my phone started ringing. It was Dave. "Dude, did you seriously bury the HOA office?" He was laughing so hard he could barely speak. I cleared their driveway, just like Karen demanded. Not my fault if there was nowhere else to put the snow. This is legendary. Everyone's driving by to take pictures. Social media is going crazy. I checked my phone and saw that someone had created a neighborhood Facebook group post with photos of the snow pile. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. People were calling it malicious compliance at its finest and karma in action. But I knew Karen would lose her mind, and I was right. She showed up at my door at 8:30, pounding so hard I thought she might break the glass. I opened the door calmly. "Good morning, Karen. You blocked the HOA office. We can't get in. We have a meeting tonight. I cleared your driveway exactly as you demanded. You didn't specify where to put the snow. This is vandalism. This is destruction of property. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. I cleared snow from your property." "That's not vandalism. But while you're talking to the police, you might want to discuss that unauthorized towing of my vehicle." Officer Thompson seemed pretty interested in that. Karen's face went through several shades of red and purple. "You think you're so clever. This isn't over. I'll have you evicted from this neighborhood." "You can't evict someone from a house they own, Karen. And that emergency meeting is still happening tonight, whether you can access the office building or not. We can hold it right here in my driveway if we need to." She pointed a finger at me, her hand shaking with rage. "You're going to regret this." She stormed off, and I watched her slip on the same icy patch as before. She caught herself this time, but just barely. I probably should have felt bad about that, but I didn't. The police did show up about an hour later, but it was Officer Thompson again, and he seemed more amused than concerned. "So, Mr. Emerson, I understand you did some snow removal this morning." "Yes, sir. The HOA president demanded I clear their driveway, so I did." "And you piled all the snow against their door." "I had to put it somewhere. The parking lot and driveway are completely clear." He walked around to look at my documentation, photos of the letter from Karen and the timestamps showing when I'd done the work. He nodded slowly. "Look, between you and me, this is hilarious. And technically, you didn't do anything illegal. You cleared snow from their property. Where you piled it is questionable, but not criminal. However, Miss Whitmore is claiming this is harassment and property damage." "Property damage. It's snow. It'll melt." I explained that to her. "She wants to press charges anyway, but I don't see any criminal activity here. This is a civil dispute, and honestly, given that she's been trying to fine you for not doing this exact work, I think she doesn't have a leg to stand on. I'd recommend she hire someone to remove the snow herself if it's such an emergency." "So, am I in any trouble?" "No. I'm going to file this report as a civil dispute and move on, but maybe try to stay out of her way for a while. She seems pretty vindictive." "That emergency HOA meeting is tonight at 7. She can't stop it, and I think things are going to change around here pretty soon." Officer Thompson smiled. "Good luck with that. We've had a lot of calls from this neighborhood lately, more than usual. It'd be nice if things settled down." After he left, I spent the rest of the day preparing for the evening meeting. I printed copies of all the documentation I'd gathered, the real bylaws, examples of Karen's abuse of power, statements from neighbors about their experiences, and the timeline of everything that had happened with me. At 6:30, people started gathering at the community center. Since the HOA office was still blocked, we'd moved the meeting to the larger space. I was worried Karen might try to cancel it, but the community center was owned by the city, not the HOA, so she had no authority there. By 7, the room was packed. I counted at least 75 people, which was remarkable for an HOA meeting. Usually, these things drew maybe a dozen residents. Karen was there with her 2 board cronies, Richard Morrison and Sandra Lang, both of whom looked extremely uncomfortable. Karen tried to start the meeting by claiming it was out of order, but I stood up and reminded everyone that according to our bylaws, an emergency meeting called by petition superseded regular meeting procedures. I had the bylaws right there, highlighted and ready. "Fine," Karen snapped. "Let's get this over with. What exactly is this meeting about?" I took the floor. "This meeting is about holding our HOA board accountable for abuse of power. Specifically, President Whitmore has been using her position to harass residents with frivolous fines, fabricate violations, and make demands that have no basis in our community bylaws or Iowa state law." I went through everything methodically. I showed examples of Karen's bogus violation notices. I read testimonials from neighbors about their experiences. I showed the letter demanding I clear the HOA driveway, then showed everyone Section 12.7 of the actual bylaws, which had nothing to do with snow removal. I explained the illegal towing of my vehicle and the police report filed as a result. Karen tried to interrupt several times, but other homeowners shouted her down. They wanted to hear everything. When I finished my presentation, I opened the floor for others to share their experiences. What followed was an hour of people standing up and telling stories about Karen's reign of terror. Every single story followed the same pattern. Karen found some obscure or completely fabricated rule, issued a violation notice with a hefty fine, and then threatened liens or legal action when people pushed back. She'd created an environment of fear in what should have been a peaceful neighborhood. The worst story came from Eric Paulson, a single dad who lived on the next street over. He stood up, visibly shaking with emotion. "My daughter has leukemia," he said quietly. "She's 8 years old. Last month she was in the hospital for 2 weeks. During that time, I couldn't keep up with yard work because I was at Children's Hospital in Iowa City every single day. Karen sent me a violation notice with a $500 fine for neglecting property appearance. When I explained the situation and asked for an extension, she said medical issues weren't her problem and that I should hire a service. I'm drowning in medical bills. I can't afford a lawn service, and she threatened to put a lien on my house." The room went dead silent. Then someone started clapping, then someone else. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding Eric. Karen's face had gone white. "I didn't know about the medical situation," she stammered. "He never told me. I sent you an email explaining everything," Eric shouted. "You replied saying bylaws don't make exceptions for personal problems." That was the turning point. Up until then, I think some people thought maybe Karen was just overzealous or misguided, but that story showed she was deliberately cruel. Board members Richard and Sandra both looked like they wanted to disappear. I called for a vote of no confidence in Karen Whitmore as HOA president. The vote had to be done by secret ballot according to our bylaws, so we passed out papers and had everyone write yes or no. We counted the votes publicly, with multiple witnesses. The result was 71 votes for removal, 3 against. Karen had voted for herself, along with 2 people I didn't recognize and suspected might not even live in the neighborhood. "This is invalid," Karen shouted. "You can't just remove me. I was elected." "Actually, we can," said Margaret Foster, a retired lawyer who lived near the entrance of the subdivision. "It's right here in Section 18 of the bylaws. A vote of no confidence requires a simple majority of homeowners present at a properly called meeting. We have well over that. You're removed effective immediately." I'll sue all of you." "On what grounds?" Margaret asked calmly. "You're welcome to try, but you'll lose. And given some of the things I've heard tonight, you might want to be careful about drawing more legal attention to your actions as president." Karen grabbed her purse and stormed out, Sandra and Richard following behind her. The room burst into applause and relieved laughter. But we still had work to do. We held an immediate election for a new board. Margaret Foster was elected president unanimously. 2 other level-headed homeowners, Tom Bradley and Jennifer Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law, were elected to fill out the board. Their first act was to vote to rescind all fines issued by Karen during her tenure pending individual review. Their second act was to hire a lawyer to review everything Karen had done to make sure the HOA itself wasn't liable for any of her actions. The meeting finally ended around 10:30. I was exhausted but felt better than I had in weeks. People kept coming up to shake my hand and thank me for taking action. Eric Paulson hugged me with tears in his eyes. "You have no idea what this means," he said. "I've been so stressed, thinking I might lose my house while my daughter is fighting cancer. Thank you." "You're not going to lose anything," I promised him. "That fine is gone, and if you ever need help with yard work or anything else, you just ask. This neighborhood takes care of its own." I thought that was the end of it. Karen was gone, we had a new board, and life could get back to normal. But I should have known better. The following Monday, I got a call from Officer Thompson asking me to come down to the police station to make a formal statement. When I arrived, he led me to a small conference room where a detective was waiting. "Mr. Emerson, I'm Detective Sarah Chen," she said, shaking my hand. I wondered if she was related to Mrs. Chen from my neighborhood but didn't ask. I need to ask you some questions about Karen Whitmore and the HOA. Sure. What's going on? After Friday's meeting, our department received several complaints about Miss Whitmore's conduct as HOA president. We started looking into things, and we found some irregularities with HOA finances. Can you tell me what the monthly HOA fees are in your neighborhood? $150 per month per household. And how many houses are in the subdivision? About 120. Detective Chen nodded, writing something down. So that's roughly $18,000 per month, or $216,000 per year. Do you know what that money is supposed to cover? Basic maintenance, landscaping of common areas, snow removal of community streets, insurance for the common buildings, and some reserve fund for major repairs. When was the last major project funded by the HOA? I thought about it. I've only been here 8 months, but I don't think there have been any. Before I moved in, I was told they repaved the main entrance about 3 years ago. We pulled the HOA's financial records. In the past 18 months since Miss Whitmore became treasurer and then president, approximately $180,000 has been withdrawn from HOA accounts. The money was supposed to go toward various projects and expenses, but we can't find evidence that most of those projects ever happened. There are invoices from companies that don't appear to exist, checks made out to vendors that have no business license or tax records. I felt my stomach drop. You're saying Karen stole from the HOA? We're investigating that possibility. I need you to walk me through everything that's happened, particularly any documentation you have about fines, fees, or demands she made. I spent the next 2 hours telling Detective Chen everything and providing all my documentation. She was particularly interested in the towing incident and the fabricated fines. She explained that if Karen had been using her HOA position to generate fraudulent fines that she then collected, that could constitute fraud and extortion in addition to the potential embezzlement. How much trouble is she in? I asked. If we can prove what we think happened, she's looking at multiple felony charges: embezzlement, fraud, possibly identity theft if she was creating fake vendor identities. We're talking years in prison potentially. I left the police station in a daze. I'd wanted Karen out of power, but I never imagined she was running a full-scale criminal operation. I called Margaret Foster to let her know what was happening. I'm not surprised, Margaret said grimly. I started reviewing the HOA financial records this weekend. They're a mess. We're bringing in a forensic accountant to do a full audit. If money is missing, we'll find it. Over the next few weeks, the investigation expanded. Police interviewed dozens of homeowners. The forensic accountant discovered that Karen had been systematically siphoning money from the HOA for over a year. She'd created fake companies, generated false invoices for work that was never done, and paid herself through various schemes. The fraudulent fines she'd been issuing were an additional revenue stream. She'd collect the fine money directly, deposit it into HOA accounts to make the books look better, then withdraw it again through her fake vendor payments. In total, she'd stolen over $200,000. She'd used the money to pay for luxury vacations, a new car, and renovations to her house. The woman who'd been terrorizing everyone about 6-inch too large wreaths and garbage can lids had been living off stolen community funds. Karen was arrested in early March. I was at work when it happened, but Dave sent me a video someone had captured on their doorbell camera. Police cars rolled up to her house, and officers walked her out in handcuffs while her husband stood in the doorway looking shell-shocked. Apparently, he'd had no idea what she'd been doing. The arrest made the local news. HOA president accused of embezzling over $200,000 was the headline on the Cedar Rapids Gazette website. The story detailed the charges: 3 counts of felony theft, 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of identity theft, and multiple counts of extortion related to the false fines. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she'd simply made accounting errors and that the fines were legitimate attempts to enforce community standards. But the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors had paper trails, bank records, and testimony from dozens of residents. In June, faced with the mountain of evidence, Karen pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony theft and 1 count of fraud. The other charges were dropped as part of the plea deal. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus penalties and legal fees. The total came to over $300,000. Her house went up for sale almost immediately. The entire neighborhood watched with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief as the moving trucks came and her now ex-husband packed up and left. I heard through the grapevine that he'd filed for divorce within days of her arrest. Meanwhile, life in Meadowbrook Estates improved dramatically. Margaret Foster ran the HOA with common sense and transparency. She published monthly financial reports so everyone could see where their money was going. The new board created a reasonable violation policy that focused on actual problems like safety hazards, rather than petty aesthetic complaints. They even established a community assistance fund to help homeowners facing temporary hardships, like medical emergencies or job loss, keep up with basic property maintenance. Eric Paulson's daughter, Emily, went into remission that spring. The neighborhood threw a huge celebration party in the community center. People brought food, kids ran around playing, and there was a genuine sense of community that I'd never experienced before. Eric pulled me aside at one point. "You know, if you hadn't stood up to Karen when you did, I don't know what would have happened to my family. That stress of potentially losing our home while Emily was sick, it was killing me. You saved us." "I just did what anyone should do when someone's abusing their power," I said, feeling embarrassed by the praise. "No, most people don't. Most people keep their heads down and hope the problem goes away. You took action. That matters." As summer arrived and the snow was long gone, I sometimes thought about that February morning when I'd stood in the pre-dawn darkness with my snow blower, methodically piling 20 inches of snow against Karen's precious HOA office door. It had been petty and vindictive, sure. But it had also been the catalyst that brought everything into the open. If I just quietly complied with her illegal demands, or if I'd backed down when she threatened me, she might have continued her schemes for years. The snow pile I'd created had been over 6 feet tall and had taken 3 full days to completely melt, even with Karen hiring an emergency snow removal service at her own expense. By the time it was gone, the investigation was already underway, and her world was beginning to crumble. In a weird way, that pile of snow had been the first domino to fall. One evening in July, I was sitting on my front porch enjoying a beer when Tom Bradley walked over from his house down the street. He had a 6-pack in his hand and held one out to me. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes in the street. "You know," Tom said finally, "I spent 22 years in the Army, did 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I've dealt with a lot of difficult people and complicated situations. But that woman, Karen, she was something else. She had this talent for making you feel small, like you were constantly doing something wrong even when you knew you weren't." "She was a bully," I said simply. "Yeah, and bullies need someone to stand up to them. I'm ashamed to say I never did." I just paid her ridiculous fines and tried to stay off her radar, but you didn't. You fought back and you did it smart. You followed the rules, documented everything, and built a case. That's how you win. I just got lucky. If she hadn't been stupid enough to have my car towed, we might not have had enough ammunition to take her down. Don't sell yourself short. You created the opportunity for luck to happen. There's a difference. We finished our beers while the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The subdivision was peaceful, the way a neighborhood should be. Kids playing, people walking dogs, neighbors chatting across fence lines. It was everything I'd hoped for when I bought my house here. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the Iowa State Attorney General's office. They were conducting a broader investigation into HOA fraud and abuse across the state, and they wanted to interview me about my experience. Apparently, Karen's case had opened up a larger conversation about HOA oversight and the potential for corruption in these community organizations. I agreed to the interview and ended up speaking with an assistant attorney general named Michael Torres. He was very interested in the documentation I'd kept and the timeline of events. The problem with HOAs, he explained, is that they operate with very little oversight. They have significant power over people's homes and daily lives, but they're not subject to the same checks and balances as actual government entities. Cases like yours highlight the need for better regulation and transparency. So what happens now? I asked. We're proposing new legislation that would require regular audits of HOA finances, create clearer processes for disputing violations, and establish penalties for board members who abuse their authority. It's going to be an uphill battle because a lot of people see HOAs as private organizations that should be able to self-regulate, but cases like Whitmore's prove that doesn't always work. The proposed legislation became a minor news story in Iowa. I ended up being interviewed by a couple of local news stations about my experience. I kept it simple and focused on the facts: the abuse of power, the fake fines, the embezzlement, and the importance of homeowners standing up for their rights. One of the interviews aired on the evening news, and my phone blew up with messages from people across the state sharing their own HOA horror stories. Some were similar to mine: petty tyrants on power trips issuing ridiculous violations. Others were worse: cases of obvious corruption or discrimination. A few were actually kind of funny, like the guy whose HOA tried to fine him for having a vegetable garden because it was agricultural use prohibited in a residential zone. I started to realize just how widespread the problem was. HOAs were supposed to maintain property values and community standards, but in many cases, they'd become vehicles for small-minded people to exercise control over their neighbors. Karen hadn't been an aberration. She'd been an extreme example of a much larger issue. By September, the new HOA legislation had passed the Iowa State Legislature and was signed into law by the governor. It required annual financial audits for any HOA with more than 50 homes, established a state ombudsman office to handle complaints, and created penalties for fraudulent violations. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Margaret Foster invited me to a special HOA meeting that month where we celebrated the new law and officially closed the chapter on the Karen Whitmore era. The meeting was well attended, and the mood was celebratory. Margaret presented me with a plaque that read in recognition of outstanding service to the Meadowbrook Estates community. It was cheesy, but I appreciated the gesture. "I think we should also acknowledge," Margaret said to the assembled homeowners, "that none of this would have happened if Xavier hadn't been willing to stand up and fight when it would have been easier to just pay the fake fine and move on. He risked retaliation, spent his own time and money documenting the abuse, and ultimately sparked the investigation that brought a criminal to justice. That's real courage. People applauded, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I'd never set out to be any kind of hero. I'd just been angry about an injustice and stubborn enough to not let it go. After the meeting, I drove home through the neighborhood I'd come to genuinely love. The streets were lined with mature trees just starting to show their fall colors. Porch lights glowed warmly. Someone was having a backyard barbecue, and the smell of grilled burgers wafted through the air. This was what community was supposed to feel like. I thought about that morning back in February, standing in the bitter cold with a certified letter in my hand, being told I had to shovel someone else's driveway or face escalating fines. I thought about the anger and frustration I'd felt, and the moment when I'd decided to fight back in the most literally pointed way possible, by giving Karen exactly what she'd asked for. That giant pile of snow against the HOA office door had been more than just malicious compliance. It had been a statement. It had said, "I'm done being pushed around. I'm done accepting unreasonable demands. I'm going to follow your rules to the absolute letter, and if that makes you look ridiculous, that's on you." Sometimes you have to make a stand, even over something as seemingly trivial as snow removal. Because it's never really about the snow or the garbage cans or the wreath sizes. It's about power and control, and the fundamental question of whether you're going to let someone else dictate your life through fear and intimidation. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my truck for a moment, looking at my house. I'd made a good life here. I had friendly neighbors, a strong community, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd made a real difference. All because I'd refused to shovel a driveway that wasn't my responsibility and had the stubbornness to see the fight through to the end. Inside, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on my back deck. The evening was cool but pleasant, and the stars were starting to come out. My phone buzzed with a text from Dave. "Beer tomorrow after work. Want to hear about the new people moving into Karen's old house?" "Definitely," I typed back. Life moved on. Karen Whitmore was serving her sentence at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville. The money she'd stolen was being repaid in installments to the HOA, though we'd never get it all back. But the community had recovered and was stronger for having gone through the ordeal together. I learned later that the people who bought Karen's house were a young couple with a baby, first-time homeowners who were nervous about HOA rules. I made a point to welcome them to the neighborhood and assured them that the new board was reasonable and fair. The relief on their faces was obvious. As October arrived and the leaves began to fall, I found myself actually looking forward to winter. Not because I enjoyed the cold or the snow, but because I knew that when the first big storm hit, I'd wake up early, fire up my snow blower and clear my own driveway. Just my driveway. And that would be enough. The whole experience had taught me important lessons about standing up for what's right, about the power of documentation and persistence, and about the importance of community. But it had also taught me something simpler. Sometimes, the most effective form of resistance is giving people exactly what they ask for, just not in the way they expected. I never did get formally thanked by Karen for clearing that HOA driveway so thoroughly. But watching her get arrested and hauled away in handcuffs was thanks enough. Justice doesn't always come in the form you expect, but when it comes, it's satisfying. The neighborhood settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following months. Property values actually increased once word spread that we'd cleaned house and had competent leadership. People who'd been considering moving decided to stay. New families moving in specifically cited the strong community bonds and transparent HOA management as selling points. I ran into Officer Thompson at the grocery store in November. He recognized me and came over to chat. "I heard about the sentencing," he said. 6 years. That's substantial." "She stole over $200,000 from her neighbors," I replied. "She earned it." You know, in my 15 years on the force, I've dealt with a lot of HOA disputes. Usually, they're just annoying neighbor stuff that should be handled civilly. But every once in a while, you get a case like this where real crimes are being committed. I'm glad we were able to help get to the bottom of it. I appreciate you taking it seriously from the start. When you came out about the towing incident, you could have just blown it off as a civil matter. Something about her story didn't sit right. When someone's that insistent that they're the victim when the facts don't support it, there's usually more going on underneath. Turns out my instincts were correct. We chatted for a few more minutes before going our separate ways. It struck me how many people had played small but important roles in bringing Karen down. Officer Thompson taking the towing complaint seriously. Margaret Foster stepping up to lead the new board. Eric Paulson having the courage to share his story at the meeting. All the neighbors who'd signed the petition and shown up to vote. It had been a true community effort. As Christmas approached, the neighborhood looked like something out of a holiday movie. People went all out with decorations, no longer afraid of getting violation notices for wreaths that were 3 inches too large or lights that were the wrong color. There was a house lighting contest sponsored by the new HOA board, with prizes for various categories. The whole thing was voluntary and fun, not mandatory and stressful. I put up a modest display, nothing fancy. But on December 23rd, I came home from work to find a large wreath hanging on my front door. It was at least 3 feet in diameter, decorated with red ribbons and silver bells. There was a card attached. "Thank you for giving us back our community. Merry Christmas from everyone at Meadowbrook Estates." It was signed by what looked like 50 different people. I stood there in the cold, reading all the names, and I felt genuinely moved. I'd helped these people, and they wanted me to know they appreciated it. That evening, there was a neighborhood caroling event. I'm not much of a singer, but I bundled up and joined the group walking from house to house. We sang off key versions of classic carols, drank hot chocolate from thermoses, and laughed at ourselves. At one point, we walked past the community center and the HOA office building. The building looked different now. Margaret had arranged for new landscaping and better lighting. There was a cheerful wreath on the door, and a sign announcing that the office would be closed from December 24th through January 1st for the holidays. It looked welcoming instead of intimidating. I thought about that pile of snow I'd created against that same door almost a year ago. It seemed like ancient history now, but it had only been 10 months. So much had changed in such a short time. As we walked back toward our street, I fell into step with Tom Bradley. "You know what the best part of all this is?" he asked. "What's that?" "I'm not afraid anymore." For 2 years under Karen, I was constantly worried about what new rules she'd invent or what fine she'd issue. I check my mailbox with dread every day. Now I just check it. It's amazing how much energy anxiety takes. Getting that back feels like a weight off my shoulders. "I know what you mean," I said, "and it shouldn't be that way. We're homeowners, not tenants living under some tyrant's thumb. We have rights. Thanks to you, now we know that, and we know how to fight back if we need to." The holidays passed peacefully. I spent New Year's Eve at a party hosted by Dave and his wife, where at midnight we all toasted to a better year ahead and to new beginnings. Standing in that crowded living room, surrounded by friends and neighbors, I realized just how much my life had improved since moving to Cedar Rapids. I'd found not just a house, but a real home and a real community. January came, and with it, more snow. I woke up one Saturday morning to find 6 fresh inches had fallen overnight. I got dressed, made my coffee, and headed out to my garage. As I fired up my snow blower, I saw neighbors doing the same up and down the street. We waved to each other and got to work. I cleared my driveway in neat, efficient lines, piling the snow in reasonable places where it wouldn't block anything important. When I finished, I helped my elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson with her driveway. Then I helped the young couple in Karen's old house with theirs. By the time I was done, my back was sore and my hands were cold, but I felt good. That's what community is supposed to be. People helping each other because it's the right thing to do, not because some petty dictator is threatening them with fines. I looked at the clear driveways and sidewalks up and down the street and felt proud of what we'd all built together. Later that day, I got an email from the Iowa Attorney General's office. The legislation inspired by the Whitmore case had led to investigations of HOAs across the state. They'd uncovered 3 other cases of embezzlement and dozens of cases of abuse of power. Changes were happening, slowly but surely. Michael Torres, the assistant attorney general I'd spoken with, had included a personal note in the email. "Xavier, I wanted you to know that your willingness to speak up and share your story has made a real difference. We're seeing HOAs across Iowa becoming more transparent and accountable. Board members are thinking twice before abusing their authority. Homeowners are more aware of their rights. This is exactly the kind of systemic change we hope to achieve. Thank you for your courage." I saved the email and went about my day. That evening, I attended a board meeting where Margaret presented the HOA's annual financial report. Every dollar was accounted for, clearly explained and properly documented. People asked questions, and Margaret answered them patiently and thoroughly. There were no secrets, no hidden agendas, no fake invoices. At the end of the meeting, Margaret announced that the HOA had received the full insurance payout for the money Karen had stolen, minus the deductible. Combined with the restitution payments that would come from Karen's prison wages and seized assets, the community would be made financially whole within a few years. "We're going to use some of these recovered funds to make real improvements," Margaret said. "We're repaving the tennis courts, upgrading the playground equipment, and installing better lighting along the walking trails. These are things your HOA fees are supposed to pay for, and from now on, that's exactly what they'll do." People applauded enthusiastically. This was what good governance looked like. This was what we'd been paying for all along, before Karen had diverted our money into her own pockets. As winter deepened and February approached, I sometimes thought about writing down everything that had happened. The whole story from start to finish, as a cautionary tale for others dealing with HOA abuse. But I never quite got around to it. I was too busy living my life, enjoying my home and participating in my community. The anniversary of the snow pile incident came and went without much fanfare. It was just another winter day with another round of snow to clear. But Dave sent me a text that morning. "Happy Snow Pile Day, 1 year since you became a legend." I laughed and sent back a snowman emoji. It had become a running joke in the neighborhood, but it was also a reminder of what we'd overcome together. In March, I got a letter from the Iowa Department of Corrections. It was from Karen Whitmore. My first instinct was to throw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was surprisingly brief and almost seemed sincere. "Xavier, I know you have no reason to listen to anything I have to say. I've had a lot of time to think about my actions and the harm I caused. I was wrong about everything. I let power go to my head and I justified terrible behavior by telling myself, I was enforcing rules and maintaining standards. The truth is, I was just a bully who enjoyed controlling people. When you stood up to me, it threatened that control, and I tried to destroy you for it. I'm genuinely sorry for what I did to you and everyone else in the neighborhood. I know I can never make it right, but I wanted you to know that I take full responsibility. I hope someday you can forgive me, though I understand if you can't. I read the letter twice. Part of me wanted to believe it was genuine remorse. Another part suspected it was just a manipulation tactic, trying to make herself look good for a parole hearing down the road. In the end, I decided it didn't really matter. Karen was in prison. The neighborhood had moved on, and whether or not she was truly sorry didn't change anything. I filed the letter away in a drawer and didn't respond. Some things don't need a response. Spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and the return of green grass and blooming flowers. The neighborhood looked beautiful, and there was a sense of renewal in the air. The HOA organized a community cleanup day where everyone came out to spruce up the common areas. We planted new flowers, touched up paint, and repaired some of the older benches along the walking trails. Working alongside my neighbors, I realized this was what I'd wanted when I bought my house here. Not perfection, not strict enforcement of aesthetic rules, but simply a clean, safe, friendly place where people treated each other with respect. We had that now, and it was worth fighting for. As summer returned and the days grew longer, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd learned over the past year and a half. I'd learned that standing up to bullies works, but you have to be strategic about it. I'd learned that documentation is crucial, that building alliances is important, and that sometimes you have to get creative with your resistance. I'd learned that most people want to do the right thing but need someone to take the first step. Most importantly, I'd learned that home isn't just a building. It's a community of people who look out for each other, who stand together against injustice, and who create the kind of environment where everyone can thrive. That's what Meadowbrook Estates had become, and I was proud to be part of it. One evening in July, exactly 18 months after the snow pile incident, I was sitting on my porch when a car pulled up in front of my house. A woman in her 30s got out, looking around the neighborhood with an appraising eye. She saw me and walked up. "Hi, I'm looking at the house that just went on the market 2 streets over. I'm trying to get a feel for the neighborhood. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Not at all," I said, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. "Have a seat." She sat down and pulled out her phone, which had a list of questions. "How's the HOA? That's my biggest concern. I've heard horror stories about HOAs from friends." I couldn't help but smile. "Well, you're asking the right person. Let me tell you a story about this HOA." I gave her the full history, from Karen's reign of terror to her eventual arrest and imprisonment, from the emergency meeting to the reform legislation we'd helped inspire. I explained how the current board operated with transparency and fairness, how the community had come together, and how we'd transformed the HOA from a source of stress into an actual benefit. The woman listened with wide eyes. "That's incredible. So you're the one who piled all the snow against her door, guilty as charged," I admitted. "It was petty, but it worked." "That's not petty, that's brilliant. You gave her exactly what she asked for." She laughed and shook her head. "I think I'm going to put in an offer on that house." "This sounds like exactly the kind of community I want to be part of." "We'd be happy to have you," I said sincerely. She did end up buying the house, and she turned out to be a great neighbor. She was an attorney who specialized in property law, and she volunteered to help the HOA board review our bylaws and make sure everything was in proper legal order. It was just another example of how the right people in the right community could make everything better. As fall approached again and the leaves started to turn, I took stock of my life. I had a job I enjoyed, a house I loved, and neighbors who'd become genuine friends. I'd helped bring a criminal to justice and inspired real legislative change. I'd stood up to a bully and won. Life was good. The second winter after the incident was unremarkable in the best possible way. Snow fell, people cleared their driveways, the HOA maintained the streets, and life went on without drama. There were no ridiculous violation notices, no fake fines, no police investigations. Just a normal, peaceful neighborhood doing normal, peaceful things. I realized that this was the happy ending, not some dramatic conclusion or perfect resolution, but simply the return to normalcy. The absence of fear and chaos, the presence of community and mutual respect. Sometimes the best outcome is just getting back to the way things should have been all along. On a Saturday morning in February, 2 years after I'd created the legendary snow pile, I was clearing my driveway after a moderate snowfall when Tom Bradley walked over with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing me one. "Thanks, man. Appreciate it." We stood there sipping our coffee and watching the neighborhood wake up. Kids were already out building snowmen. Someone's dog was bounding through the snow, barking joyfully. A couple was walking hand in hand down the sidewalk, enjoying the winter morning. You ever think about what would have happened if you just cleared that HOA driveway when Karen told you to? Tom asked. Sometimes. I think she'd probably still be in charge, still stealing from us, still making everyone miserable. One person giving in doesn't stop a bully, it just encourages them. That's what I think too. Your stubbornness saved this neighborhood. It wasn't just me, it took all of us. Yeah, but you started it. That matters. We finished our coffee in companionable silence. Then Tom headed back to his own driveway and I finished clearing mine. As I put my snow blower away, I looked at the HOA office building visible in the distance. Its driveway was being cleared by a professional service the HOA had hired, just like it should be. I went inside, took a hot shower, and settled in to enjoy the rest of my Saturday. Through my window, I could see my perfectly cleared driveway, my well-maintained house, and my peaceful neighborhood. This was what I'd fought for. This was what that pile of snow had ultimately represented, the right to live in peace, free from petty tyranny and corruption. And you know what? It was absolutely worth it, every shovelful.